For those of you who wonder whether Jesus is really God, come in the flesh, look at what he says in verse 34. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to. How would he know all that? He didn't learn it in rabbi school. The rabbis didn't talk about how their forefathers killed all the prophets. The rabbis had a much more glowing report about their history. But more than that, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would have none of it. What? Who is this that says this? No prophet in their right mind would ever say this. This has to be somebody more than a prophet. By the way, when people tell you Jesus never claimed to be God, you can just tell them they're mistaken. You can't read Jesus. You can't read what he says and come to the conclusion that he was a nice guy who had good things to say, but you can take him or leave him. You just cannot do that with him. And anybody who says, well, I can take him or leave him, and he said some really good things, but I think he may have been mistaken about this or that, and he was a wise person and maybe a prophet, but you know, there's a lot of prophets in the world and blah, 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 blah. All that tells me is that you just not read what he says. Because what he says in things like this, and this is so it's not like he stands up and does a lecture on his ontological deity. It's that he just in passing makes a comment. I would have gathered you. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Well, there's only one person who can say that in the first person. I would have gathered you. There's only one person who can say that. And that has to be Yahweh, God. Everywhere you turn, when you look into what Jesus said, what you find is you cannot be neutral about him. You can reject him. And if you do reject him, you better reject everything he says, because everything he says and does is based on his character and based on his ontological being. Ontology means beingness. On his real being, the essence of who he is. So if you hear people say, well, Jesus is okay, and I don't want to say anything bad about him, he was a good prophet, he was this or that, but I'm not going to worship him, I'm not going to see him as really God, and I'm not going to deal with him in reality. Well, I'm sorry, that's just ignorant. And there's a huge amount of it in our world. People who dare to take Jesus seriously and really read what he says, invariably are brought to the point where they have to deal with him.